Welcome to Business Jargon Decoded, a comprehensive 1 hour guide to understanding the language of business. If you've ever sat in a meeting nodding along while having no idea what anyone was actually saying, this episode is for you. Business jargon is a language unto itself. Some of it serves a legitimate purpose, compressing complex ideas into efficient shorthand. But a lot of it is, frankly, nonsense, used to sound smart without saying anything meaningful, to obscure the fact that someone doesn't know what they're talking about, or to make simple things seem complicated. Today we're going to decode the most common business terms, explain what they actually mean in plain English, and more importantly, tell you when they're being used properly and when they're being used to deceive or impress without substance. Here's what we'll cover. First, we'll explore why jargon exists and when to be suspicious of it. Second, we'll decode financial metrics, the numbers that get thrown around in meetings and reports. Third, we'll tackle performance metrics and frameworks. Fourth, we'll cover technology and operations terminology. Fifth, we'll decode compliance and legal jargon. And finally, we'll talk about organizational and strategy buzzwords. By the end of this hour, you'll never nod along cluelessly again. You'll understand what people are actually saying, and you'll be able to call out bullshit when you see it. Let's start with why jargon exists in the first place. Before we dive into specific terms, let's understand why jargon exists at all, because understanding the motivation helps you decode whether jargon is being used legitimately or not. Jargon exists for 4 reasons, and only 2 of them are legitimate. The first reason is signaling. When someone uses industry-specific terms correctly, they're signaling that they belong, they understand the domain, they're part of the in-group. This is natural and mostly harmless. When a doctor uses medical terminology with other doctors, it's efficient and shows competence. The second reason is efficiency. Some jargon genuinely compresses complex ideas into shorthand. When an engineer says, "Let's do a code review," that's more efficient than explaining the entire process of having another developer examine code for bugs, style, and best practices. The term carries a lot of meaning efficiently. The third reason is where it starts to get ugly: gatekeeping. Sometimes jargon is used deliberately to exclude outsiders. If you don't know the terms, you feel stupid, and that's the point. It protects incumbents and intimidates newcomers. This happens a lot in finance, law, and medicine. The fourth reason is the worst: obscuring. Sometimes people use jargon because they don't actually understand what they're talking about, and the jargon sounds smart enough to hide that fact. If someone can't explain something in plain English, they might not actually understand it themselves. As we go through terms today, keep asking yourself, is this jargon serving efficiency, or is it serving gatekeeping or obscuring? That tells you whether to embrace the term or be suspicious of the person using it. Here's a test I use constantly: the plain English test. When someone uses jargon you don't understand, ask them to explain it in plain English. "Can you help me understand what that means practically?" is a powerful question. Watch what happens next. People who truly understand the concept will explain it clearly. They might say, "Fair point, let me break that down." They'll give you a concrete explanation that makes sense. People who are using jargon to hide their own confusion will struggle. They'll rephrase with more jargon. They'll give you a circular definition. They'll get defensive or dismissive. Einstein supposedly said, "If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough." Whether he actually said that or not, the principle is sound. The best test of whether someone understands a concept is whether they can translate it for an outsider. Jargon cascades are a red flag. That's when someone explains jargon with more jargon, which requires more jargon, and you end up more confused than when you started. This is usually a sign that the speaker doesn't have a firm grasp on the underlying concepts. Never be embarrassed to ask for clarification. The shame is in nodding along and making decisions based on words you don't understand, not in asking a question. I want you to really internalize this principle. The best experts in any field can translate their expertise for outsiders. They can take complex concepts and make them accessible without losing accuracy. This is actually harder than using jargon. It requires deeper understanding. When someone drowns you in terminology, Try asking them to explain it like you're a smart person from a different field. If they can't, they might not understand it themselves. And if they refuse to try, that tells you something about their intent. Throughout this episode, I'm going to give you plain English translations of common business jargon. My goal is that you walk away understanding these concepts well enough to explain them to others. That's the standard of true understanding. Let's start with financial metrics. These are the numbers that get thrown around in board meetings, investor pitches, executive reviews, and financial reports. Many people nod along while having no idea what these actually mean, how they're calculated, or how they can be manipulated. ROI stands for return on investment, and on the surface it seems simple. Take what you gained, subtract what you spent, divide by what you spent. That gives you a percentage return. The formula is ROI equals gain minus cost divided by cost. If you spend $100 and get back $150, your ROI is 50%. But here's where it gets complicated. What counts as a gain? If you run a marketing campaign, how do you attribute sales to that specific campaign versus everything else you're doing? If you buy software, what's the monetary value of time saved? What time period do you measure? Short-term ROI might look different from long-term. A project might lose money in year 1 but be highly profitable by year 3. In practice, most ROI calculations are optimistic fiction. People include gains that are only partially attributable. They exclude costs that should count. They cherry-pick time periods that look good. They make assumptions that favor the desired conclusion. I've seen the same project have an ROI of negative 20% or positive 300% depending on how you run the numbers. Both calculations can be technically defensible. When someone quotes you an ROI, ask, what's included in the gain? What's included in the cost? What time period? Who calculated this? And did they have an incentive for it to look good? Those questions usually reveal that the number is less solid than it seems. EBITDA stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. In plain English, it's profit before a bunch of real costs that don't go away just because you ignore them. Let me break down what each of those exclusions means. Interest is the cost of debt. If you borrowed money to run your business, you have to pay interest. That's a real cost. Taxes are, well, taxes, also a real cost. Depreciation is the accounting recognition that your physical assets, buildings, equipment, vehicles wear out over time and lose value. That's a real cost. Amortization is similar, but for intangible assets like patents, software, or goodwill from acquisitions. Also a real cost. Why would anyone use a metric that excludes all these real costs? Because it makes profit look better. If you have significant debt, the interest payments eat into your profit. If you have lots of assets wearing out, depreciation hits your numbers. EBITDA lets you report a bigger number by ignoring these inconvenient realities. The cynical definition of EBITDA is earnings before all the bad stuff. It's popular in private equity, acquisitions, and startup pitches because it makes companies look more profitable than they actually are. When someone quotes EBITDA, ask what net income looks like. That's the actual profit after all the real costs. The gap between EBITDA and net income tells you how much reality is being swept under the rug. CAC and LTV are fundamental metrics for subscription and SaaS businesses. CAC is customer acquisition cost. It's how much you spend to acquire each new customer. Add up your sales and marketing expenses and divide by the number of new customers acquired. Simple in concept. LTV is lifetime value. It's the total revenue a customer generates over their entire relationship with you. If a customer pays $100 a month and stays for 3 years on average, the LTV is $3,600. The standard wisdom is that your LTV to CAC ratio should be at least 3 to 1. Each customer should bring in at least 3 times what you spent to acquire them. This ensures you're building a sustainable business, not just buying revenue. Here's the problem. Both numbers are often guesses, especially in early-stage companies. CAC calculation varies wildly. Do you include the salaries of the sales team, the cost of the website, the founder's time spent on sales? Different companies calculate it differently, making comparisons misleading. LTV is even more problematic. You're projecting how long customers will stay and how much they'll spend. In a young company without years of history, This is projection based on limited data, and those projections tend to be optimistic. I've seen founders pitch LTV to CAC ratios of 10 or higher based on assumptions that, when you dig in, have no basis in actual customer data. They're projecting ideal behavior, not observed behavior. When someone quotes these numbers, ask, how is LTV calculated? How much actual customer history is behind that estimate? What's the churn rate? The answers reveal whether the numbers are solid or hopeful fiction. MRR is monthly recurring revenue. ARR is annual recurring revenue, which is usually just MRR times 12. These are the metrics that subscription businesses live and die by. Recurring revenue is valuable because it's predictable. Unlike one-time sales, you can reasonably forecast that most of your existing customers will continue paying next month. This makes planning and valuation easier. A growing MRR or ARR chart is the dream of every SaaS company. It shows momentum, it suggests a healthy business, and it makes for compelling pitch decks. But here's what these metrics can hide: churn. Churn is the rate at which customers leave. If you're acquiring new customers faster than you're losing existing ones, your MRR will grow even if your underlying business is sick. I've seen companies with beautiful MRR growth that were actually in trouble. They were spending unsustainably to acquire customers who weren't sticking around. The growth chart looked great right up until the money ran out. The metric that tells the real story is net revenue retention, or NRR. This measures how much revenue you retain from existing customers after accounting for churn, downgrades, and expansions. A healthy business has NRR above 100%, meaning existing customers are spending more over time, offsetting any losses. When looking at MRR or ARR, always ask about churn rate and net revenue retention. Those reveal whether the growth is healthy or just a leaky bucket getting refilled faster than it drains. Burn rate and runway are critical metrics for any company that's not yet profitable, which includes most startups and growth stage companies. Burn rate is how fast you're spending money, typically measured monthly. If you have $1 million in the bank and you're spending $100,000 more than you're making each month, your burn rate is $100,000. Runway is how long until the money runs out. It's calculated by dividing your cash by your monthly burn rate. In the example above, with $1 million and $100,000 monthly burn, you have 10 months of runway. For startups, 18 months of runway is generally considered healthy. That gives you time to hit milestones, adjust if things aren't working, and raise your next round of funding without desperation. Less than 6 months of runway is danger territory. You're either about to be profitable, about to close new funding, or about to be in serious trouble. What often gets missed in burn rate discussions is the distinction between gross burn and net burn. Gross burn is total spending. Net burn is spending minus revenue. A company might have a high gross burn, but a low net burn if revenue is growing quickly. Also, watch for burn rate trends. A burn rate that's increasing faster than revenue is a warning sign. A burn rate that's stable or decreasing while revenue grows is a sign of improving efficiency. When someone mentions runway, ask about the trend in burn rate and whether any major changes are planned that would affect it. Gross margin is one of the most fundamental financial metrics, yet it's often confused with net margin or profit margin generally. Gross margin is revenue minus the direct cost of producing what you sell, divided by revenue. If you sell a product for $100 and it costs you $30 to make or acquire, your gross margin is 70%. What counts as direct cost? For a physical product, it's the materials, labor to manufacture, and shipping to get it to the customer. For software, it's mainly the cost of servers and support to deliver the service. For services, it's the time of the people delivering the service. What doesn't count? Overhead like rent, marketing, administrative salaries, research and development. Those come out of gross profit to determine operating profit. Different industries have very different gross margin expectations. Software companies often have gross margins of 70 to 90% because software costs little to duplicate once built. Manufacturing companies might have 30 to 50% margins because physical products have significant material and labor costs. Retailers often operate on razor-thin margins of 10 to 20%. When comparing companies, look at gross margin relative to their industry. A retailer with 30% gross margin is exceptional. A software company with 30% gross margin is in trouble. Gross margin trends matter too. Improving gross margin suggests better efficiency or pricing power. Declining gross margin suggests rising costs or competitive pressure forcing price cuts. Ask about gross margin when evaluating any business. It tells you how much room there is to cover operating costs and generate profit. SAGR stands for Compound Annual Growth Rate. It's the average annual growth rate over a period of time, assuming growth happens smoothly. If a company had 10 million in revenue 5 years ago and has 20 million now, the CAGR is about 15%. That's the consistent yearly growth rate that would get you from 10 to 20 million over 5 years. CAGR is useful for comparing growth across different time periods or different companies. It gives you a standardized way to express growth that accounts for compounding. But CAGR can be misleading because it hides what happened in between the start and end points. A company might have grown explosively in years 1 and 2, then flatlined or even declined in years 3 through 5. The CAGR would still look decent, but the trend is concerning. I've seen this used deceptively in pitch decks. Pick your starting point when things were at a low, pick your end point during a peak, calculate a flattering CAGR, and hide the fact that recent growth has stalled. When someone quotes CAGR, ask for the year-by-year breakdown. What happened in each year? Is growth accelerating, steady, or decelerating? The trajectory matters as much as the average. Also be wary of CAGR calculated over very short periods. 2 years of data isn't really enough to establish a meaningful growth rate, and CAGR over very long periods can hide significant changes in the business. CAGR is a fine summary statistic, but treat it as an invitation to dig deeper, not as a conclusion in itself. Now let's move from financial metrics to performance metrics. These are the numbers organizations use to track how well things are going. They come with their own set of problems and opportunities for misuse. OKRs stand for Objectives and Key Results. Google popularized them, and now seemingly every company uses them, mostly incorrectly. The structure is simple. An objective is a qualitative description of what you want to achieve. It should be inspiring and clear, something like become the market leader in customer satisfaction. Key results are the measurable outcomes that indicate you've achieved the objective. 3 to 5 quantifiable results like achieve NPS of 60 or higher, or reduce customer complaint rate by 50%. The system sounds great on paper. The problems arise in implementation. The crucial distinction most companies miss is between aspirational and committed OKRs. Aspirational OKRs are stretch goals where achieving 70% is considered success. They're meant to push you beyond what's comfortable. Committed OKRs are promises where anything less than 100% is failure. Most companies don't make this distinction clear. They set stretch goals but treat them like commitments. This leads to sandbagging, where people set conservative OKRs to ensure they hit them, or to burnout, where people exhaust themselves trying to achieve impossible targets. Another common failure is too many OKRs. If you have 15 objectives each with 5 key results, you have 75 things to focus on. That's not focus, that's a to-do list. Good OKR implementation involves ruthless prioritization. When someone talks about OKRs, ask, are these aspirational or committed? What happens if someone achieves 70%? How many total OKRs does the organization have? The answers reveal whether OKRs are being used effectively or just as buzzword decoration. KPI stands for Key Performance Indicator. It's any metric you track to measure performance. Revenue, customer satisfaction, defect rate, time to resolution, these are all KPIs. The challenge with KPIs comes from a principle called Goodhart's Law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Here's what this means. Suppose you want to improve customer service. You decide to measure it by average call duration, because efficient calls seem like a good proxy for effective service. You set a target of keeping calls under 5 minutes. What happens? Agents start rushing callers off the phone. They solve simple issues quickly and transfer complex ones to avoid time penalties. Average call duration goes down, but customer satisfaction, that might go down too, because people are getting rushed and their problems aren't actually being solved. The metric was gamed. People optimized for the number, not for the underlying goal. This happens constantly. If you measure salespeople on revenue alone, they'll discount heavily to close deals that might not be profitable. If you measure developers on lines of code, they'll write verbose code. If you measure recruiters on hires, they'll lower the bar. Good organizations regularly review whether their KPIs are still measuring what they intended. They look for perverse incentives. They use multiple metrics to prevent gaming any single one. When you see KPIs, ask, how might people game this metric? What behavior does this incentivize that we might not want? The best KPIs are hard to game and directly tied to actual organizational goals. NPS or Net Promoter Score is one of the most widely used and most overrated metrics in business. It comes from one question: how likely are you to recommend us to a friend or colleague on a scale of 0 to 10? People who answer 9 or 10 are promoters. They love you and will spread the word. People who answer 0 through 6 are detractors. They're unhappy and might badmouth you. 7s and 8s are passives. They're neutral and don't count. Your NPS is the percentage of promoters minus the percentage of detractors. It ranges from negative 100, everyone is a detractor, to positive 100, everyone is a promoter. The appeal of NPS is simplicity, one number that supposedly captures customer loyalty. But that simplicity is also its weakness. One number cannot capture the complexity of customer experience. Customers might love your product but hate your customer service. They might be happy overall but concerned about a specific issue. NPS flattens all of this nuance into a single score. NPS is also easily manipulated. Companies survey customers right after positive interactions. They only survey satisfied customers. They phrase the question with priming. We're so glad we could help you today. Quick question, would you recommend us? The NPS looks great, but it doesn't reflect reality. The original research claimed NPS correlates with company growth. Subsequent studies have shown mixed results. Plenty of high NPS companies grow slowly. Plenty of mediocre NPS companies grow quickly. NPS is fine as one input among many. It's dangerous as the primary measure of customer satisfaction. When someone brags about NPS, ask how it's measured and what other customer metrics they track. The balanced scorecard is a framework that says financial metrics alone give an incomplete picture. You need to balance them with other perspectives. The traditional balanced scorecard has 4 perspectives. First, financial, the lagging indicators like revenue, profit, and return on investment. These tell you how you did. Second, customer, metrics like satisfaction, retention, and market share. These tell you how customers perceive you and whether you're building loyalty. Third, internal process, operational metrics like efficiency, quality, and cycle time. These tell you whether your operations are working well. Fourth, learning and growth, metrics around innovation, employee development, and organizational capabilities. These tell you whether you're building for the future. The insight is that these perspectives are connected causally. If you invest in employee development, learning, and growth, you improve processes, internal process, which increases customer satisfaction, customer, which drives revenue, financial. Financial metrics are lagging indicators. By the time they go bad, the problem started much earlier. Leading indicators in the other perspectives can give you early warning. The danger, of course, is measurement overload. If you track everything in every perspective, you drown in data. The art is choosing the vital few metrics in each perspective that actually predict outcomes. When evaluating a business or strategy, ask whether they're looking beyond financial metrics. A company that only watches the financial scoreboard is driving by looking in the rearview mirror. One that balances all perspectives sees the road ahead. Let's decode technology and operations terminology. These terms come up constantly in modern business, and many non-technical people nod along without understanding. Agile is one of the most misunderstood terms in business. It originated as a software development methodology but has spread to project management, marketing, and beyond. The core idea is simple. Instead of planning everything up front and executing a fixed plan, work in small iterations. Build a little, get feedback, adjust, repeat. This allows you to adapt as you learn. The Agile Manifesto, the foundational document, emphasizes individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. In practice, many organizations reduce Agile to a set of rituals. They do 2-week sprints, they have daily stand-ups, they use Jira, but they haven't embraced the underlying philosophy of adaptability and customer focus. True Agile means being willing to change direction based on feedback. It means shipping early and often rather than waiting for perfection. It means empowering teams to make decisions rather than following rigid hierarchies. When someone says they're agile, ask how often they ship to customers, how they incorporate customer feedback, and how often they change direction based on learning. The rituals, the stand-ups and sprints don't matter much. The responsiveness and adaptability are what count. DevOps combines development and operations. Historically, developers would write software and throw it over the wall to operations teams who would run it. When things broke, there was finger pointing. Developers said operations deployed it wrong. Operations said developers wrote buggy software. DevOps is a philosophy that says the people who build software should be responsible for running it too. There's no wall to throw things over. Developers own the full life cycle, including what happens at 3 a.m. when the service crashes. This alignment of incentives improves quality. When you get paged for the bugs you write fewer bugs. When you experience the pain of difficult deployment, you make deployment easier. DevOps involves practices like continuous integration, continuous deployment, infrastructure as code, and comprehensive monitoring. But these practices are in service of the cultural shift, not replacements for it. One of my pet peeves, DevOps is not a job title. I see job postings for DevOps engineer constantly. They usually mean someone who manages infrastructure and automation. That's fine, but DevOps is a culture and set of practices for how teams work together, not a specialized role. When someone says they're doing DevOps, ask whether developers get paged when their code causes outages. Ask if development and operations are in different silos. The answers reveal whether they have DevOps culture or just renamed some job titles. The cloud is one of those terms that sounds mystical but has a simple meaning: computers in someone else's data center. When your email is in the cloud, it means it's stored on servers owned by Google or Microsoft or whoever, rather than on a computer in your office. When software runs in the cloud, it means it runs on those remote servers. There are 3 main service models. SaaS is software as a service. You use an application that runs entirely in someone else's infrastructure. Gmail, Salesforce, Slack. You don't manage any servers, you just use the software through your browser. PaaS is platform as a service. You write code, you deploy it to a platform, and the platform handles all the infrastructure. Heroku, Google App Engine, Azure App Service. You focus on your code, they handle servers, scaling, and maintenance. IaaS is infrastructure as a service. You get virtual computers, storage, and networking. Amazon EC2, Azure Virtual Machines, Google Compute Engine. You have more control but also more responsibility. You manage operating systems, security patches, and scaling. As you move from SaaS to PaaS to IaaS, you get more control and more responsibility. Most businesses use a mix: SaaS for standard tools like email, PaaS, or IaaS for custom applications. When someone says something is cloud-based, that could mean many different things. Ask what level they're talking about and whether the infrastructure is managed by someone else or just hosted elsewhere. API stands for Application Programming Interface. It's how software systems communicate with each other. Think of it like a restaurant menu. The menu tells you what the kitchen can make for you and how to order it. An API tells other software what services are available and how to request them. When you use an app that pulls in weather data, it's using a weather API. When your accounting software syncs with your bank, it's using a banking API. When you log into a website using your Google account, that's an authentication API. APIs are critical for integrations. If you want 2 systems to work together, they need compatible APIs. If you want to automate processes that span multiple tools, you need APIs. For business people, what matters is whether APIs exist and whether they're good. A product with a good API can be integrated and extended. A product without APIs is an island. When evaluating software, ask about API availability. Is there an API? Is it well documented? Are there limits on usage? Are there additional costs? These factors affect how well the software will play with everything else you use. You don't need to understand the technical details of APIs. You just need to know that they're the plumbing that connects systems, and good plumbing matters. Technical debt is a powerful metaphor that every business person should understand. When software developers take shortcuts to deliver faster, maybe by copying code instead of creating reusable components, or by skipping documentation, or by not writing tests, they're taking on technical debt. Like financial debt, it lets you move faster now, but you'll have to pay it back later with interest. The interest comes in the form of slower future development. Code that's hard to understand takes longer to modify. Systems without tests break more often. Poorly documented processes require more time to maintain. Some technical debt is strategic. If you need to launch quickly to beat a competitor, taking on some debt might be the right call. You can clean it up later if the product succeeds. This is like taking out a loan to fund a business opportunity. Some technical debt is accidental. Developers make decisions without realizing the future cost. Requirements change and render old code awkward. This debt accumulates without anyone intentionally choosing it. The problem is when technical debt gets out of control, every change becomes harder. Bugs appear in unexpected places. What should take days takes weeks. At extreme levels, it becomes cheaper to rewrite from scratch than to keep patching. When development seems slow despite a large team, ask about technical debt. When estimates keep getting longer, ask about technical debt. When a simple change seems to break unrelated things, there's probably a lot of debt accumulated. Good engineering organizations track technical debt, prioritize paying it down, and make conscious trade-offs about when to incur new debt. Poor organizations just let it accumulate until it crushes them. Scalability is a system's ability to handle growth, whether that's more users, more data, or more transactions. A scalable system can grow by adding resources rather than redesigning. An unscalable system breaks or becomes prohibitively expensive as load increases. There are two main approaches to scaling. Vertical scaling means making individual machines more powerful, adding more memory, faster processors, bigger storage. This is simple but has limits. At some point, you can't buy a bigger machine. Horizontal scaling means adding more machines that share the work. This can scale almost infinitely, but it's architecturally complex. You need to figure out how to coordinate work across machines, how to keep data consistent, and how to handle failures. Why does this matter for business? Because systems that can't scale fail precisely when you succeed. Imagine your marketing campaign goes viral. Suddenly you have 10 times more users than yesterday. If your systems don't scale, your website crashes, customers can't buy, and your moment of success becomes a disaster. I've seen companies spend years building a product, finally get traction, and then collapse under the weight of their own success because they never planned for scale. That's a tragedy. When evaluating technology, ask about scalability. How many users can this handle? What happens if we grow 10 times? What would we need to change? The answers tell you whether you're building on a solid foundation or one that will crack under pressure. Let's tackle compliance and legal jargon. These acronyms strike fear into business people because they come with audits, legal requirements, and the threat of significant fines. GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a European Union law that governs how companies collect, process, and store personal data of EU residents. Even if you're an American company that's never set foot in Europe, GDPR probably applies to you. If you have any customers who are EU residents, if your website is accessible in Europe, you're likely subject to GDPR. The key requirements: you need explicit consent to collect personal data. People have the right to see what data you have about them. They can request you delete it. They can request you transfer it to a competitor. That's data portability. You need to have a legal basis for processing data. You need to report data breaches within 72 hours. You need to protect data with appropriate security measures. The enforcement has real teeth. Fines can reach 4% of global annual revenue. For large companies, this can mean billions of dollars. Even smaller companies have faced significant penalties. Those annoying cookie consent banners on every website, that's GDPR. The pop-ups asking for marketing preferences, GDPR. The ability to download your data from services, GDPR. If you handle personal data of any EU residents, you need to take GDPR seriously. The compliance burden is significant, but the penalties for non-compliance are worse. SOC2, which stands for System and Organization Controls Type 2, is an auditing standard that proves an organization has security controls in place. If you're selling software to enterprises, especially in regulated industries, customers will ask for your SOC2 report. It's become table stakes for B2B software companies. There are two types. SOC2 Type 1 is a point-in-time assessment. An auditor checks that you have policies and controls documented and issues a report. It says that on this particular date, these controls existed. SOC2 Type 2 is over a period, typically 6 to 12 months. The auditor checks that you actually followed your controls consistently throughout that period. Type 2 is more valuable because it proves ongoing compliance, not just a one-time setup. The audit covers 5 trust service criteria: security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. Most companies focus on security and availability. Getting SOC2 certified is a significant undertaking. You need documented policies for access control, encryption, logging, incident response, employee onboarding and offboarding, and more. You need to actually follow those policies and prove you're following them. When a vendor says they're SOC2 compliant, ask whether it's Type 1 or Type 2 when it was issued, and whether you can see the report. Type 2 with a recent date and a clean opinion is the gold standard. HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Despite the name, the part everyone cares about is the privacy rule and security rule that protect patient health information. If you're a covered entity, meaning a healthcare provider, health plan, or healthcare clearinghouse, HIPAA applies directly to you. But it also applies to business associates, which means any vendor that handles protected health information on your behalf. If you're a software company and a hospital uses your product to manage patient data, congratulations, you need to be HIPAA compliant. You'll need to sign a business associate agreement and meet all the security requirements. HIPAA requires specific controls around access, encryption, auditing, and breach notification. If you have a data breach involving patient information, you may need to notify the Department of Health and Human Services, the affected patients, and potentially the media. Violations can be severe. Fines range from $100,000 to $50,000 per violation, with an annual maximum of $1.5 million for repeat violations. In cases of willful neglect, criminal charges are possible. Here's a weird HIPAA quirk. Fax machines are still widely used in healthcare specifically because they're considered HIPAA compliant. Meanwhile, modern encrypted email is often viewed with suspicion. The regulation was written before modern technology, and it shows. If you're building anything that touches healthcare data, assume HIPAA applies and design for it from the start. Retrofitting HIPAA compliance is painful. Let's finish with strategy and organizational buzzwords. These are the terms that fill corporate communications and can mean almost anything or nothing at all. Synergy is perhaps the most mocked word in business jargon, and for good reason. The concept is legitimate. Synergy means the combination of two things produces more value than they would separately. 2 plus 2 equals 5. When a company with great products acquires a company with great distribution, the combined entity might grow faster than either would alone. The problem is that synergy is invoked to justify almost any acquisition, merger, or initiative, regardless of whether real synergies exist. I'll let you in on a secret. Most projected synergies never materialize. Study after study shows that the majority of acquisitions fail to deliver promised synergies. Different cultures clash. Integration is harder than expected. Key people leave. Customers get confused. When someone talks about synergies, ask for specific examples. What exactly will be better combined than separate? How will you measure it? What's the timeline for realizing these synergies? What's the track record of past synergy projections versus reality? Vague promises of synergy should be treated with extreme skepticism. Real synergies can be articulated specifically. If someone can't explain exactly what the synergies are, they might not exist. Digital transformation is a term that can mean profound change or empty buzzword, depending on how it's used. The genuine meaning is using technology to fundamentally change how an organization operates and delivers value to customers, shifting from paper to digital processes, moving from in-person to online services, using data to make decisions that used to be based on intuition. Real digital transformation is hard. It requires changing not just technology but also processes, skills, culture, and often business models. It takes years, it's expensive, it frequently fails. The way the term is often used, though, is just we're doing tech stuff. We bought some software, we made an app, we're on the cloud. None of this is transformation in any meaningful sense. A company that digitizes its paper forms but keeps the same slow processes hasn't transformed. A company that builds an app but still requires customers to call for real issues hasn't transformed. Technology without process change is just expensive cosmetics. When someone talks about digital transformation, ask what's actually changing. What can customers or employees do now that they couldn't before? What processes have been eliminated or fundamentally redesigned? If the answer is vague, the transformation might be too. Pivot comes from lean startup methodology and means a fundamental change in strategy based on learning from the market. The classic example is a startup that builds one product, realizes there's no market for it, but discovers in the process that there's a huge need for something else. The shift from the original idea to the new one is a pivot. Pivoting can be smart. Better to change direction based on evidence than to persist with something that isn't working. Some very successful companies emerged from pivots. Instagram started as a check-in app. Slack started as a gaming company. But pivoting can also be rationalized failure. Some founders pivot every few months, never committing long enough to really test any idea. They call it learning when it might be inability to execute. When evaluating a company that has pivoted, ask why. What was learned that motivated the pivot? Is this the first pivot or the fifth? How committed is the team to the current direction? Is there evidence that this direction is working? A single pivot from a clearly failing strategy to a promising new one is often positive. Serial pivoting suggests either a lack of good ideas or a lack of ability to execute on any idea. Move the needle means to have a meaningful impact on important outcomes as opposed to doing work that looks productive but doesn't really matter. Imagine a speedometer needle. Lots of activities might create the appearance of motion without the needle budging. Real impact is when the needle visibly moves. This is actually a useful concept. It forces you to ask whether an activity will make a difference to outcomes you care about. Lots of business activities are needle-free. Reports that no one reads. Meetings that produce no decisions. Initiatives that generate activity but not results. The question, will this move the needle, is a legitimate prioritization tool. Before starting something, ask whether it will meaningfully impact important outcomes. If not, maybe your time is better spent elsewhere. Of course, it can be overused. Not everything that matters moves the needle immediately. Building relationships, learning new skills, maintaining systems. These don't always show immediate needle movement, but are still important. Use move the needle as a filter against obvious busy work. But don't let it become an excuse to ignore everything that doesn't have immediate measurable impact. Low-hanging fruit refers to opportunities that are easy to capture, the wins that require minimal effort but still provide meaningful value. The metaphor comes from fruit trees. The fruit near the ground is easy to pick. You don't need a ladder or much effort. In business, low-hanging fruit might be obvious process improvements, easy customer complaints to fix, or quick optimizations that no one has gotten around to doing. Going after low-hanging fruit can be a smart strategy. Early wins build momentum. Quick improvements generate goodwill. Demonstrating impact fast can buy you time and support for harder initiatives. But there's a danger. Organizations that only ever pick low-hanging fruit never climb the ladder. At some point, the easy stuff is done and you need to tackle harder problems. If you've trained your organization to only do easy things, the hard things never get done. I've seen teams congratulate themselves endlessly on small improvements while ignoring major problems that required sustained effort. The quick wins become an addiction, an excuse to avoid the difficult work. The best approach is balance. Capture the low-hanging fruit, absolutely, but also invest in the harder projects that require more effort and time. Use the quick wins to build credibility and momentum for the longer efforts. When someone says they want to start with low-hanging fruit, ask what the plan is for the higher fruit. If there's no plan, you might be building a culture that avoids challenge. Boil the ocean means to attempt something so ambitious that it's essentially impossible, like literally trying to boil the entire ocean. When someone says, let's not boil the ocean, they're warning against scope creep, the tendency for projects to expand beyond what's achievable. They're advocating for focus and realistic boundaries. This warning is usually wise. Many projects fail not because the core idea is bad, but because the scope expanded until delivery became impossible. What started as improve the checkout process becomes redesign the entire e-commerce platform. What began as update the logo becomes complete brand overhaul across all properties. Good projects have clear boundaries. They define not just what's in scope, but what's explicitly out of scope. They have criteria for completion that don't keep moving. They resist the temptation to add just one more thing. When you hear someone suggest expanding a project's scope, mentally check whether they're starting to boil the ocean. Ask questions like, what's the minimum viable version? What can wait for phase 2? What's the real deadline? Of course, sometimes ambitious is right. Some problems really do require large-scale change. The key is being honest about what you're taking on. If you're going to boil the ocean, know that's what you're doing, plan accordingly, and don't pretend it's a quick fix. Most of the time, though, let's not boil the ocean is good advice. Focus on what's achievable, deliver that, and iterate from there. Let me close this section with two of the most common meeting phrases you'll hear. Circle back and take this offline. Let's circle back on this means we'll return to this topic later. It can be legitimate. Sometimes a meeting isn't the right venue for a topic, or you need more information before deciding. Circling back later makes sense, but circle back can also be a polite way of saying, I don't want to deal with this. Some topics get perpetually circled back on, never actually addressed. If you notice a pattern of circling back without resolution, someone is probably avoiding the issue. Let's take this offline means let's not discuss this in the current meeting, we'll handle it separately. Again, this can be legitimate. If two people need to resolve something that doesn't involve everyone else, taking it offline respects the group's time. But take offline can also mean I don't want to have this conversation in front of others. Sometimes that's about discretion. Sometimes it's about avoiding accountability. If sensitive topics always get taken offline and you never hear what happened, something might be getting hidden. The pattern to watch for is deflection. When topics consistently get pushed to later, to offline, to another meeting, ask yourself whether they're actually getting addressed or whether they're being avoided. Legitimate scheduling results in eventual resolution. Avoidance results in the same topics coming up repeatedly without progress. If you find yourself being told to circle back on something important, try gently pinning it down. Great, let's schedule that follow-up now. When works for you? If the other person resists even scheduling, that tells you something about their intent. Let me close with the key principles from our hour together. First, jargon should clarify, not obscure. Legitimate jargon compresses complex ideas efficiently. It makes communication faster among people who share context. If jargon is making things less clear instead of more clear, something is wrong. Second, always ask for plain English explanations. Never be embarrassed to ask what something means. The shame is in pretending to understand and making decisions based on words you don't know, not in asking questions. Third, numbers always have assumptions, and those assumptions matter. When someone quotes a metric, ROI, LTV, NPS, ask how it was calculated, what's included, what's excluded, what assumptions were made. The number by itself tells you very little. Fourth, if someone can't explain something simply, be skeptical. True understanding allows for clear explanation. Jargon cascades and circular definitions often indicate shallow understanding rather than deep expertise. You now have a decoder ring for business jargon. You understand the most common terms and how they're used and misused. You have frameworks for evaluating claims and asking smart questions. The next time you're in a meeting full of jargon, you'll know what people are actually saying. And when you don't know, you'll have the confidence to ask. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next episode.